Company is a legal entity formed by different individuals to generate profits. Every single owner or every single founder will have an intention of how he wants to set up the company, how he wants to take the company, whether he wants to move into a public zone or into a private zone altogether. If you're not able to do so, if you're not able to build a competitive analysis, a competitive strategy for yourself and create a conducive growth factor, then you will not be able to continue long for a company. Good morning and welcome to the first session on company law, and this is a very interesting subject in the 5th semester for B.B.A. Company law is a subject that we are going to see not just from a legal standpoint, but also trying to understand the structure, the definition, why it matters the most once you have started building up an empire for yourself. So these days, company law is not just going to be a legal subject anymore, just trying to talk about the sections or just trying to talk about the law front alone. It is more going to be about a deeper understanding of how a company needs to be formed and what are all the formalities that are making the company a very interesting subject overall. Moving forward, let's talk about the introduction today to the company law altogether. Now, the introduction for a company is quite interesting for all of us. A company follows the provisions mentioned in the Companies Act of 2013, what we are studying, which means an company which is incorporated under this. In other words, company is a legal entity formed by different individuals to generate profits through their commercial activities. Now, very interesting and a simple statement that has been told about. Most of us, right from our beginning, from our childhood days, we would have always dreamt about this factor that I want to start my own company. I want to be an entrepreneur by myself. But how do I do it? What is the conditions, the terms that are involved in terms of understanding or starting a company? Who is this company all about? Of course, we do have our own intentions, our own ideas in terms of naming the company with fancy names, with fancy ideas all about. But is the company well under the purview of the law? Is it well structured under the factors called as the Company Act altogether? So what happens here is that we first need to understand the company as a legal entity itself. So that's why we say it's a legal entity. It has its own identity. It has its own name. It has its own presence altogether. So that's why company law is a very interesting subject. You cannot say that the company, since it does not have a life, it is not an entity at all. How is the company different from the owner? Definitely, yes, the company is different from the owner. The company has its own name, it has its own brand, it has its own logo, so it has a different identity altogether. So company is a legal entity which is formed by different individuals to generate profit through their commercial activities. The ideology of a company is definitely to generate profit. Nobody can deny on that factor at all. Why? Because companies' ideology in terms of running, the intention or the objective is that in the long run we make money out of the business and then we use it for a commercial transaction purpose altogether. But from the law standpoint, from a legal standpoint, you need to look into the company as a separate body, as a separate entity altogether. So that's why whenever we talk about the word company, it is a separate entity when compared to the owner. So you have to look at it as a separate person, as a separate identity. Followed by, what is the company structure? The line of business the company will definitely generate and determine which business structure it chooses, such as a partnership, or it might be a proprietorship, or it might be a corporation. Now, most of us have our own ideas in starting a business. Some of us want to start a law firm. Some of us might be thinking about starting a consulting, a design firm, or we might be interested in starting a manufacturing firm. Sometimes we might be interested in starting our own restaurant chain altogether. But the levels of business under which a particular person involves himself is quite different. It's entirely different. Why? Because the way how it has been done, the way how it has been projected altogether matters a lot. So that is why it is very, very important here to understand, to take it forward as a team, as an entity altogether. Now, what we try to here go further in terms of understanding the company is that the structure in terms of the business operation. Now, the way how a consulting firm works will not be the same way how a legal or, for example, a hotel or a manufacturing firm might work, because the structure of business, the nature of business, the kinds of operation is entirely different. Now, when you look into an e-commerce firm, it might not have the same kind of business when compared to that of another educational institution or another private firm altogether. So what happens here is that the line of business at which you are working, the line of business in which the entity is seeking, will also help in terms of creating the ownership structure. Now, when you talk about a single company, that is a one-man company, or a structured ownership, or when you start talking about a group entity, or when you start talking about a partnership basis or about a corporation basis, there are different formats in which they are registered, and there are different rules and regulations that needs to be followed as a company structure altogether. So that's why this becomes a very, very interesting topic for all of us to get involved into it and start working on it. Followed by, there's also a distinction between the private and the public company. So when I talk about a private company and when I talk about a public company, they are two different entities altogether. They might not be the same in terms of understanding the values or in terms of understanding the ownership pattern altogether. They are a different structure here in terms of understanding, in terms of working altogether. So when we start looking into the ownership aspect, every single owner or every single founder will have an intention of how he wants to set up the company, how he wants to take the company, whether he wants to move into a public zone or into a private zone altogether, is definitely the mastermind or the idea of the owners or the founders. So based on that, we will have our regulations, we'll have our financial reporting requirements and the other commitments towards the society. So in general, when I talk about the company and its definition here, we try to understand the company more from a separate legal entity which has its own presence, which has its own features and its understanding as a structure, as a setup, as an element by itself. Moving forward, what are the key factors of a company that we are talking about? The first thing, as I have told you, it is a separate legal entity which is formed by a group of individuals who engage in an operation or in any kind of activity so to generate profit. So that is how you see that the operation of a business enterprise is more on a commercial perspective, and they are people who are engaged in doing some activity in order to generate profit. Followed by, a company's business line depends on its structure. What kind of structure are we talking about today? Which range from partnership to that of proprietorship or to a corporation altogether. So when we are talking about this, the business line depends on the structure. That means to say that on what kind of structure are we talking about? Is it a partnership? Is it a proprietorship? Or is it even a corporation altogether? Which means to say, if it is going to be partnership, we are going to have a different legal structure. If it is a proprietorship, then we are going to have a different legal structure, reporting standard. Or if it is a corporation altogether, if it's going to be like Microsoft Corporation, Google Corporation, or an Apple Corp, like this, then we will have a different entity, we will have a different reporting structure for it. Followed by, the companies might be either public or private. That means to say that there are factors. Now, for example, private company will not get into listing. Public companies are mostly listed companies who are there in the exchange. So when I talk about public companies, they are listed in stock exchange, they'll have a different kind of board of directors, they will have a different kinds of factors, they have shares listed, whereas in private companies, they are not listed on any exchange. So when we start talking about the differences like this, the way of operating, the way of looking it into the company format will also change. So keeping all this in mind, the company factors are also built in such a manner that they will try to devise a format or a structure or a methodology altogether, which will try to tell them about the activities, about the involvement of the company. Formulated by that, when we start talking about the company is also generally organized to earn profit from business activity. So the ideology here of setting up a company is that when it is being created, the profit intention is something that is inbuilt inside the company. So company will always try to stand to earn some profit for the founders, for the owners who are working for it, and they will try to see that if they are able to generate any quantifiable matter, any quantifiable property or a profit out of it. Moving forward, how does a company works? Now, company has got its own ways of working, own dimensions of working. Why is that? Because if you look at individuals, if you look at people here, everybody have their own intentions of how their company needs to work. When you work for Google, the intention is different because they are more into a IT company, they are more into a different thought process altogether. So the way how a company functions, the way how they project themselves as a company, the way how they portray themselves in terms of operations, in terms of brand image is entirely different from what you look into a General Motors company altogether or a Ford Motor company. Why? Because these are all the ideology. When I talk about the word called as the corporate personhood, which means an entity separate from individual, the company will have its own entity, own way of performing. You cannot force a particular style into it. Now, for example, when you are trying to understand company versus the owner, now let's say that you are trying to look into HDFC Bank. HDFC Bank is a banking company by its nature. So HDFC Bank is a brand, it's a logo, it's an identity by itself. But the people who are working for the bank or people who have created the bank, the founding team, the top management team, they are entirely different. Their ideologies will be different. The banking ideology is entirely different. So that's how when you start looking into the corporate persona, the corporate personality itself, they have a different meaning, they have a different emotional appeal into the minds of the customer. So that's how they will support its operation, that's how it will run its operation, that's how it will present its operation to the people. Companies are generally organized to earn a great amount of profit through their business activity, and though some of them might be structured as non-profit organization. There are several companies or several institutions in the world who go ahead and say that they are non-profit organizations, but yet they make some considerable profit which needs to be looked into, which needs to be considered all upon. But when you talk about generally companies here, these are all companies which have the intention of making profit as far as possible. They're not just going to go back and say that, sir, we are just going to work as entities, as people who do not have any intention to make profit. They are definitely interested in making profit, and they do make profit on a regular basis. So that is how their ideology, their personality is also looked in from an investor standpoint, from a shareholder standpoint. So many a times when people look into a company, they also look it from a different background. What is the capability of the company? How much is the revenue they are generating? What type of business this company is involved into? So all sort of questions come behind when we talk about this company. Each country has its own hierarchy of company, corporate structure, though there might be many similarities altogether. So we also need to understand and appreciate this factor that when we are talking about companies, when we are talking about their hierarchies, their structures, every country will have its own set of companies, will have its own set of hierarchies altogether, and it is not going to be that easy. Why? Because when you are talking about the company, their hierarchies and the structures all together, it becomes very, very important here that we try to understand, that we try to move forward in terms of the growth, in terms of its operations altogether. There are many times where I would like to say that the company would also try to look in terms of how they are building its structure. Certain companies work on a matrix structure, certain companies are multinational companies, certain companies are transnational companies, certain companies are regional blocks. So, the way how the country looks into it, the way how the company is being structured, it has been developed altogether, goes a lot saying about its background, about its operation, about the way things are being looked in terms of building the entire hierarchy. So many countries try to start creating the organizational structure based on certain laws, certain regulations, and you might see that most of these laws and regulations are quite similar in nature. There's a lot of similarities, there are a lot of comparisons also that comes into picture. With all that keeping in mind, still the company becomes a very, very interesting entity to be talked about. Followed by, when we talk about this company, we also need to understand it has the same legal rights and responsibilities as a person, ability to enter into contracts, right to sue, borrow money, pay taxes, own assets, and hire employees. So that means to say, is company a living organization? Is it a living entity? Definitely not. But then, apart from that living factor, it is having all the same characteristics, all the features of an individual. So company will have its own name, company will pay taxes, company has got the right to get into contracts, company can sue anybody if they have gone against it, company can also borrow money, and it can issue orders and contracts, which means to say that company will function as its own factors altogether. It has a set of predetermined operations which are very much under its purview, and it will take those actions into nature and start working together as an entity, as an organization by itself. So sometimes what happens is that people get confused with this factor. The owner and the company are same? No, definitely not. The owner will pay his own taxes. He will fine for his own liabilities. He will fine for his own entities altogether. Company will work on its own basis. So if the company owner tries to exercise his influence on the company, then there is always a problem. So we need to leave the company alone, and we need to look the owner separately. We cannot combine both of them and start talking. A person might be representing a company. Let me tell that factor very, very clearly to you. I might be a CEO of a company, or I might be working as some particular important designatory authority of the company. But that doesn't mean that I own the company or I am the company. I am just a part of the company. That factor has to be clearly understood and fed inside the mind of people. Then only you will be able to distinguish yourself and start working. If you're not able to distinguish, if you're not able to differentiate and see it, then you will not be able to progress as an individual. So many times what happens is that the company will undergo all sort of activities like hiring, paying of taxes. It will also get into contracts. It will also get into the activities of regular trade. The name of the company will be used, the logo, the symbol, the trademarks, everything will come into picture when we are talking about a business entity altogether, because all these factors are a very, very common factor, are a very, very simplistic factor that starts coming inside when we are talking about an organization. Followed by, we will also talk about the company's works in terms about the benefits of starting a company includes the income diversification, a strong correlation between effort and reward, creative freedom and flexibility. Now, the intention here is very, very clear. Before we start getting into the legal entities of a company, the intention of a company is that it has a strong correlation between the reward and the risk factor. Many people start the organization because they are ready to take the risk, because there is a reward waiting for them. So the more the effort, more the ability, more the concentration and dedication in terms of developing the company will definitely result in something called as the beneficial factor, the beneficial growth perspectives altogether. So that's how the company starts growing up, the company starts creating an image for itself. Followed by the disadvantages that are there in starting a company includes the financial responsibility, the liability, the long hours, employees, administration, regulations, and the tax formation that comes into picture. So every advantage will also have a disadvantage. So when we talk about the company matters, the company factors altogether, we also need to understand there are a lot of financial liabilities, commitments, and ideologies that come into picture, by which the employees have to pay, the employees have to take care about it, and the employees have to start working towards it. So this becomes highly responsible for all these people. In terms, when you start a company, you need to know about it and you need to grow with it. If you're not able to do so, if you're not able to build a competitive analysis, a competitive strategy for yourself and create a conducive growth factor, then you will not be able to continue long for a company. These days, what happens is that there is a lot of question that comes in the financial viability, in the operations of the company, the way it is registered, the way it is functioning, the way it is able to portray a credible picture altogether. One side, people are attracted by the investments, the growth, and the fantastic opportunities that are being presented before them. But the other side, they also need to know that the concept of a company is highly challenging, because it involves a lot of risk factors also, and if those risk factors are not clearly understood, if they are not being looked into properly, then that can create a disaster altogether. With this, I would like to come to the end of the first session, which is about the introduction to company and its definition. So definitely we would have understood here that company is a separate legal entity and it is different from the owners. And this is the basic ideology about the company. I hope and believe all the information that has been shared with you today is of a high resource and of a great value to you. In the coming session, we are going to talk about the features of the company. What are the different aspects? What are the different features that come in together to define the complete organization? Thank you for joining me on this wonderful session. Stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever.